Hello and welcome to Modern Medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Cleos. Today's program is dedicated to a device that absolutely transformed the field of medicine. Computerized tomography, formerly known as computerized axial tomography or CAT scanning, gave us a glimpse into the human body never before possible with standard radiographic techniques. Over the course of this program, we'll look at the history and technology of computerized tomography and its impact on modern medicine. To understand the importance of CT scanning, it's important to know the limitations of a standard radiographic technique. A radiograph basically consists of a source of X-rays. Those are projected through the body, and all of that is recorded on a sheet of film on the other side of the patient. The problem, of course, is that we're taking a three-dimensional object and we're placing all of that onto a 2D sheet of film. So all of these three-dimensional volumetric structures inside the chest are going to be represented on a flat sheet of film, and there's superimposition of shadows, so on and so forth. The other limitation is that film is intrinsically a very poor medium to record the difference in the X-ray attenuation. And what do I mean by X-ray attenuation? The way a radiograph is obtained is as those X-rays pass through the body, they're absorbed by the different tissues in the body. Bone, being very, very dense, is going to absorb a lot of those X-rays. So on a sheet of film, the bone is going to show up white. The lungs that are filled with air block very few of those X-rays. Most of them are going to pass through the lung and onto that sheet of film, so the lungs are going to show up very, very dark. And that contrast between the bone and the air gives us an image on a sheet of film. If we had all the X-rays pass through the body, everything would look very dark and you wouldn't be able to tell one structure from the other. Another limitation of the standard radiographic technique is contrast resolution. A sheet of film is intrinsically a very poor medium for recording the different values of radiographic attenuation, X-ray attenuation. And there's basically 5 densities that we can see on a standard sheet of film. Starting from the less dense, you have air. Air shows up very black. The next dense object is fat, and fat has kind of a dark gray. After that, we have water or soft tissues, and those are listed together because water and soft tissue have about the same attenuation on a standard radiographic technique. Easy to tell those two apart on a CT scan, but not so easy on a standard radiographic image. After that, we have bone, and finally, metal, which shows up bright white because it blocks all of the X-rays passing through the body. By the end of the 19th century, Professor Röntgen's Xray Discovery 4 years earlier was a firmly established technique for medical diagnosis and treatment. However, the general population still clamored for new images depicting X-ray images of body parts, such as this foot in a shoe acquired sometime near the turn of the century. The ultimate prize in this unofficial worldwide contest was the first radiographic picture of the living human brain. We now know that because of the limitations of the standard X-ray image recorded on a photographic plate, that this elusive picture of the brain was impossible with the technologies available in the early 1900s. The brain is encased in a thick skull that blocked a good portion of the X-ray light. Additionally, the brain floats in a fluid bath called cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, that provides nutrients and acts as a cushion for the delicate brain matter itself. Because water and brain appear similar on a plain film image, the contents of the skull show up as a homogeneous shade of gray on a standard X-ray image of the skull. This image, reported in the popular press near the end of the 19th century as the first X-ray picture of the living brain, was eventually debunked as a clever fraud, actually representing cat intestines filled with a mercury compound and radiographed in a brain-shaped pan. In the early 1900s, the great scientist and inventor, Thomas Edison, announced his intentions to be the first to radiograph the brain. Because of Edison's established fame and reputation, reporters and the curious public camped outside his laboratory night and day for nearly 2 weeks awaiting the good news. But alas, even the great wizard of Menlo Park succumbed to the challenge, and the world would have to wait another 60 to 70 years to see the first radiographic images of the brain. The man primarily responsible for the development of CT scanner was a British engineer named Godfried Hounsfield, which you can see over my right shoulder here. Mr. Hounsfield initially worked on radar for the Royal Air Force, and in the late 1950s joined a company called EMI Laboratories, and he was the chief engineer in charge of England's first business computer. After the successful development of that computer, Mr. Hounsfield was giving a sabbatical to investigate possible new applications for this emerging computerized technology. And fortunately for us in the medical field, one of the areas he turned his attention to was radiology and radiographic imaging. For those of you who are Beatles aficionados, you may recognize EMI as the first label for the Beatles and their records. In the late 60s, that was the height of the Beatles' success, and according to the company, that success was the impetus to fund Mr. Hounsfield's research into computerized technology and CT scanning. So you can say that the Beatles are indirectly responsible for computerized axial tomography, another great contribution to our modern society. As I said previously, there are limitations to standard radiology. You've got a 3D image, you're taking an X-ray, all those 3D objects are superimposed onto a single 2D sheet of film, so they're all piled on top of one another. Hounsfield recognized these limitations, and he felt that he could possibly impact this particular field by using a computerized technique to reconstruct an image by taking multiple radiographic images around that object. And his presumption was based on a German mathematician's transform developed in 1917, 60 years earlier. Johann Radon described a technique where you could take multiple projections, either a one-dimension projection through a 2D object or two-dimensional projections through a 3D object, and after you take multiple projections, you can completely reconstruct that object in space. And I would equate this to multiple views of any 3D object, such as this computer-generated automobile. From the front, we can say that this vehicle is a red sports car. As we rotate to the side, we glean more information, noting that it's a two-door with chrome rims. The back displays red and yellow lights, and the final rotation to the opposite side gives us a fairly complete picture of the object as a whole. So the more projections we take around the car, the more information we can determine about the vehicle itself. The same is true for CT scanning. The more projections you take around the body, the more information you're going to have about the object you're taking images through. The advantages of X-rays, of course, is that they actually pass through the body. So not only do you get surface information, you're also going to get information about the contents of the body itself. With the theoretic feasibility of CT scanning, Hounsfield built this first prototype in the late 1960s. And basically what it consisted of was a door or a lead box with a pinhole poked into the front. Inside of that box was a radioactive material, americonium, and that provided a low-level constant X-ray source. Because of the pinhole, the X-rays came out, or the radiation came out, in a single collimated pencil beam configuration. That pencil beam configuration would pass through the objects in the center, and that information, the attenuation, would be recorded by the single detector on the other side of that object. And these objects would pass through that pencil beam detector, and once they passed all the way through, it would rotate 1 degree and pass through again. And it would continue to do this until you got 180 degrees around and completely image that entire object. This prototype had to operate 9 days continuously to acquire a single image because it was a low-level source of radiation and the technique for acquiring it hadn't really been established. 9 days continuously. So you think you're holding your breath for a couple of seconds is tough now. Can you imagine holding it for 9 days? Absolutely not possible. It then took a supercomputer at the time about 2.5 hours to process that information and reconstruct a single image. And this is that image. And the computer at the time, programmed in Fortran, had to solve the equivalent of 28,000 simultaneous equations to reproduce that particular image. And although clinically not feasible, it did show that the technique of computerized tomography was physically possible. With that in mind, Hounsfield went on to build his second prototype, pictured here. In this graphic, you can see that the radiation source was changed from a radioactive material to an actual X-ray generator. And this increased the number of radiation beams that were available to actually produce an image. Hounsfield also placed the whole bed on a lathe bed scanner, something he found in one of the adjacent offices, and he put the objects to be scanned on the lathe bed scanner. The function was identical to the first generation. There was a pencil beam collimation in the front of the scanner. It passed through the objects and was picked up by this single detector on the far side, and the objects would move through that pencil beam X-ray source, rotate 1 degree, pass again through the X-ray source, and do that 180 degrees all the way around until you had a complete scan of the image. This was called a rotate and translate. And this is the first image generated by the second prototype. Because of the X-ray source, the image was acquired faster and provided more detail than the first prototype.
As it happened, an old lathe bed was available in the lab, and by using discarded equipment also found around, I was able to build this lab test machine which would demonstrate the principle of the system.
Tests begin on a rig built from an old lathe. X-ray data is fed into a computer. Would it show up density differences in animal tissues as well as it does on the Perspex model? Hounsfield searches for specimens where he can find them.
I had to go around to abattoirs and cut out brains from cows, but unfortunately these were damaged by their method of killing, so that we found ourselves travelling across London to the Jewish kosher houses in which they killed by bleeding the bullocks. And it was quite a job carrying these across London in a paper bag to put on the machine. The ventricles did show up very well, and it was just a matter then of making a clinical machine.
At about the same time as the development of the second prototype, the design team working on the development of CT scanning came up with another way to reconstruct these images. As I said previously, the initial reconstruction was the equivalent of solving 28,000 simultaneous equations for a computer programmed in Fortran. It took a long, long time. They developed a system called filtered back projection. And basically, what you would do is you would have images that were created after each pass. You'd get a series of grayscale images. If you took those grayscale images and passed them back through the imaging plane using a computer, you could actually reconstruct that image. The more images you pass through, the more clear picture you got of the original scanned object until you made it all the way around to 180 degrees. Now you may be asking, why do we only go 180? Remember, we're using X-rays. And X-rays, if you start at this angle and pass through the object and record the information over here, basically, you're going to get the same information if you start here and pass it through this way. The X-rays are passing through the body. So you only need 180 degrees to get complete information about everything inside the body. Here is an example of filtered back projection on a non-anatomic image using inanimate objects. And you can see as you pass more and more of that information around that 180 degree arc, you get a clearer and clearer picture until you get 180 degrees around. The technique of filtered back projection is still used on modern scanners today. The first and second prototypes showed the feasibility, the technical feasibility of CT scanning, and Hounsfield was given the go-ahead to develop his first clinical scanner. And you got to remember, the first scanners were so slow that they really couldn't image anything in the chest or the abdomen, so on and so forth. They basically were designed to develop the brain. This is a picture of that first clinical scanner. The whole system was relatively small since nothing bigger than a human head had to fit in the center. Notice the sling around the patient's bottom that held the head firmly in the center of the scanner gantry. If you still couldn't control yourself and hold still for the entire exam, the technologist could place this bite block on the frame of the machine. The combination of the bottom sling and bite block absolutely ensured patient cooperation even in the most difficult situations. If you look at the image over my left shoulder, you'll see that we have a stylized skull, all done in glass that's surrounding the brain. It would be great if our skulls were all made of glass, we could see right through them and actually see the brain itself. But that's not the case. Our skulls are very dense, they're radio opaque. Visually, you can't see inside the skull, so we use indirect techniques to actually look at this brain itself. One of those techniques is standard angiography, and angiography is basically a technique where you put a catheter into the groin, run that catheter up into the vessels going up to the brain, you inject contrast, and you can actually look at the vessels of the brain itself, and you can look for shift. Sometimes you can find hypervascular tumors that have a lot of blood supply and indirectly make an assumption of what's going on inside the brain. Another technique was called the pneumoencephalogram, and the way that was done is a needle was placed into the back and air was introduced into that needle. The patient was then placed upright, and that air would bubble up through the spine and go into the center portion of the brain, or the ventricles. And these ventricles would fill with air, and now you have an extrinsic contrast. You can see the inside of the brain, which is now filled with air, against the background of water and soft tissue. The problem with this is the brain doesn't like to be covered in air. So these patients were strapped into what we call a somersault chair and flipped in all different directions to move that air throughout the ventricles, and radiographic images were taken. Because it was so painful and it was so nauseating during this process of moving the patient upside down and backwards and forward, they were usually throwing up all over themselves. So if CT scanning did nothing but replace the pneumoencephalogram, it would have been an absolute existential leap in medical care. But today, we can image the whole body, from the top of your head all the way down to your toes. The first generation scanners were strictly an imaging unit for the brain. As I said before, they were too slow to actually image anything that had motion in it, like the chest or the abdomen. The first scanners took about 20 minutes to produce a single image, and they used the same rotate and translate mechanism that we saw in the prototype images. The scanner had a pencil beam configuration. That pencil beam configuration would move across the brain, and then it would rotate 1 degree, move across the brain again, and then rotate 1 degree. And you would do this all the way around until you got 180 degrees. The information that was obtained from that scanner was then sent to a computer that was off-site. You got to remember, computers back then weren't like the machines we have today where everyone's got one on their cell phone. These were actually expensive units, and the idea was these machines would be set up remotely, the information would be sent over a phone line, and the images reconstructed. Because it was a remote machine and it was programmed in Fortran, it took about 20 minutes to produce a single image, not the whole image of the brain, but just one slice through the brain. After the computer was moved on site and programmed in a machine language, that time to acquire and reproduce that image was reduced to approximately 5 minutes. This is one of the early images from that first generation scanner. Although relatively primitive by today's standards, the image clearly showed direct radiographic information of the living human brain in sufficient detail to make an accurate clinical diagnosis. The CT scanner was first introduced to the United States in May of 1972 at Dr. Manny Schechter's neuroradiology review course in the Bronx, New York. Dr. Forrest Clore.
One of the very good comprehensive courses that was given as a review for neuroradiology was a course given at the Albert Einstein Institute, Medical Center Institute in Bronx, New York. So it was well attended. In fact, there were more than 400 attendees, plus probably 50 staff members. We decided we had an evening free, Sunday evening free, to run about Manhattan and hit a couple nightclubs and so on. And I was in my mid-20s, so didn't have as much control of myself as I do now. But and so we had a good time in New York. 2/3 of the way through the morning lectures, they got a little behind, so they were going to drop one lecture off of the morning schedule. And they also announced about 11 a.m. that they had a unscheduled guest from London that wanted to give a presentation. So when they broke for lunch, the far majority of the crowd left. They wanted to get out of there and get some lunch, because they were there not to hear somebody's research project, but to prepare for boards. So probably out of the 400 or so attendees, 390 of them just hit the door and left. Because of the pretty rough evening I had the night before this conference started, and it was enjoyable and I had a good time, but I was hungover and I did not feel like having lunch. So I thought my best bet is to sit right here in this comfortable seat and not move and just listen to what was being presented. So he presented this. It was interesting until he showed some of the images that were being produced, and then it became not only interesting but exciting.
The second generation scanners were very similar in operation to the first generation. You still had a rotate translate. The entire scanner moved back and forth and then rotated 1 degree. The configuration of the X-ray source changed from a pencil beam to a fan beam configuration. It spread out over the patient. And instead of having one detector on the other side, you actually had multiple detectors. Not a whole array, but maybe 2 or 3 or 4 detectors on the other side. And because of the increased number of detectors and the fan beam configuration, you could actually reduce the scanner time to a couple of minutes. The next generation of scanners were labeled third generation. And this was an existential leap in CT technology. And basically, we still had the fan beam collimation of the X-ray source, but instead of a 1 or 2, 3 or 4 detectors on the other side, there was a whole arc array of detectors. And the translation portion of the movement was completely eliminated. These were a purely rotational system. So what would happen is you would start with the head in one position, and you could actually rotate 180 degrees, and the gantry would stop rotation. The body was moved in a little bit, and then it was 180 degrees in the other direction. And the reason you had to go 180 degrees in one direction, stop, and then go back the other way is because all of the equipment was tethered by a whole bunch of wires and power supply. And if you kept rotating in one direction, you would rip those wires right off the scanner, and you could probably use it one time at most. The next generation scanners were called helical scanners. Same exact configuration as the third generation. Fan beam configuration of the X-ray source, multiple detectors on the other side, but instead of that 180 degree rotation, you have all the power supply and the electronics connected to a tract where you could continuously run in one direction. So now the CT gantry could run in one direction as the body passed through the X-ray source. So there was no stopping and moving the patient through. And basically, images were obtained almost like a spiral sliced ham. You know how those are sliced around and around and around, and it's a contiguous piece of meat all the way down that bone. Well, that's the way a modern CT scanner works now, is that you constantly move the patient in as the scanner goes around and around. These started off with a single detector. Now we went up to 4 detectors, 16 detectors, 64 detectors, and there's actually 128 in some systems that actually simulate 512 simultaneous detectors. So you're taking a block, a volume of image in one rotation. And the great thing about this is that we can actually image the entire body from the top of the head all the way down to the toes in basically less than 1 minute, about 35 seconds, 40 seconds. It can also give us stop motion images of moving structures like the heart. The video on the screen right now shows a modern scanner with the cover removed. Even though the machine operates in a helical or continuous circular pattern, it still takes a 180-degree rotation or half turn to acquire a set of images. In this particular case, 64 adjacent images during each half turn. A modern CT scanner provides anatomic detail of the human body absolutely unimaginable just 20 or 30 years ago. That same information is used to appropriately triage patients to maximize medical care and eliminate unnecessary, often invasive procedures such as the exploratory surgery. Although the true impact of the CT scanner to mankind is immeasurable, Hounsfield enjoyed a number of awards and accolades for his invention, including the Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1979. Sir Godfrey was knighted by the Queen of England in 1981. So that's the story of the CT scanner, all made possible by an innovative British engineer with possibly a little bit of financial help from his friends the Beatles. Great stuff. As always, stay happy, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time on Modern Medicine.
I think I'm very lucky to have thought of this idea. I was thinking about it quite a lot wandering around the countryside. Things seem to just have dropped into place like a jigsaw right from the very start. I get quite a number of letters from people who've had scans, had an operation, and have written to me thanking me very much for the scanner. It is very gratifying to know that I may have helped a little towards the conquest of disease.